At 0927 hours on December 13th, 1943, Second Lieutenant Philip Adair is 4,000 feet over the Assam Valley, staring at a mathematical impossibility. Through the haze of the Himalayas, a solid wall of aluminum materializes. 24 Ki, 21 Sally heavy bombers, shielded by 40 Ki 43 Oscar fighters. 64 enemy aircraft. Adair is alone. He is the sole sentry for the 80th Fighter Group, strapped into a P-40 Newton's Warhawk named Lulu Bell. The Curtiss fighter is rugged but obsolete, carrying enough 50 caliber ammunition for exactly 12 seconds of sustained fire. Standard doctrine for a 64-to-1 disadvantage is absolute: retreat immediately. But beneath him lies the critical Hump supply line, wide open to destruction. If Adair runs, the lifeline to China is severed. So, he shoves the throttle past the gate, pushing the manifold pressure to war emergency power. To understand how one man intends to dismantle an entire invasion force, we first need to analyze the fatal mechanical flaw of the aircraft he's flying. That flaw was weight. The P-40 Newton's Warhawk was a brawler, a 9,000-pound sled of riveted aluminum and steel built to take a savage beating and keep flying. It was an iron dog, heavy on the controls and screaming with torque, but against the aircraft heading toward Adair, weight was a death sentence. Leading the Japanese formation was the Nakajima Ki 43, codenamed Oscar by Allied intelligence. To the untrained eye, the Oscar looked dangerously similar to the famous Naval Zero, but in the thin air over the Himalayas, it was arguably more lethal. The Ki 43 was the paper tiger to Adair's iron dog. It was built with almost no armor plating and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks, stripping away every ounce of excess mass to achieve a singular purpose: supernatural agility. The Oscar possessed a secret weapon that American engineers were still struggling to counter: butterfly combat flaps. While American pilots were drilled to retract flaps for speed, a Japanese pilot in an Oscar could deploy these specialized extensions in the middle of a high-speed dogfight. These flaps instantly changed the camber, the curve of the wing, generating massive amounts of lift at the touch of a lever. This allowed the Oscar to turn on a dime, executing loops and snaps so tight that a P-40 trying to follow inside the turn would bleed all its energy, shudder violently, and enter a high-speed stall. If Adair tried to turn with them, the Oscars would simply pivot inside his radius and rake his cockpit with machine gun fire before he could complete 90 degrees of the turn. The P-40's only counter to this agility was a tactic known as boom and zoom. The doctrine was simple: utilize the Warhawk's superior weight to dive from high altitude, slashing through the enemy formation at 400 miles per hour, firing a burst, and using that accumulated kinetic energy to zoom back up into the safety of the sun before the enemy could react. It was a tactic of verticality, not horizontal turning. But boom and zoom requires one non-negotiable ingredient: altitude. At 0927 hours, Adair didn't have it. He was cruising at 4,000 feet. The Japanese formation was stacked in layers above him, holding the high ground at 12,000 feet. He had no potential energy to trade for speed. He was a heavyweight boxer trapped in a phone booth with 40 knife-wielding gymnasts. This tactical nightmare was typical for the men of the 89th Fighter Squadron, part of the legendary 80th Fighter Group known as the Burma Banshees. They were the orphans of the Second World War. While the newsreels back home focused on the P-51 Mustangs escorting B-17 seconds over Berlin or the carrier battles in the Pacific, the Banshees were fighting a forgotten war at the end of the world's longest and most treacherous supply line. They painted their aircraft cowlings with gruesome, grinning skulls, a macabre acknowledgement of their reality. They flew obsolete hand-me-downs, scavenging parts to keep their engines turning in the humid rot of the Assam jungle. If a Banshee pilot went down here, there was no air-sea rescue, no French resistance to hide him in a barn. There was only the impenetrable jungle, the tigers, and the silence. Adair knew the math of his situation intimately. He checked his fuel gauges. He had 90 minutes of gas. He checked his gun switches. The 6.50 caliber Brownings in his wings were cold. Logic in the Army Air Force tactical manual dictated that he should turn south, dive away toward the Brahmaputra River, and live to fight another day. The manual explicitly stated, "Do not engage superior numbers without altitude advantage." But directly beneath his wings lay the Dinjan and Chabua airfields. These weren't just strips of tarmac. They were the jugular vein of the Allied war effort in Asia. Sitting exposed on the runway were 14 C-47 transport planes, fully loaded with high-octane aviation fuel and munitions destined for the Hump, the suicidal airlift over the mountains to supply Claire Chennault's forces in China. If those 24 Japanese bombers reached their release point, the resulting inferno wouldn't just destroy a few planes. It would incinerate the fuel stocks required to keep the 14th Air Force flying. It would effectively ground the Allied offensive in China for months. Adair looked at the terrifying armada above him, and then down at the defenseless transports. The conflict shifted from a tactical calculation to a moral imperative. He couldn't win a dogfight. The butterfly flaps of the Oscars guaranteed that. But he realized that destruction wasn't the only way to win. The Japanese bombers, the Ki-21 Sallies, relied on rigid geometric formations to concentrate their defensive fire and maximize their bombing accuracy. If he could disrupt that geometry, if he could turn their disciplined V formations into a chaotic scatter, they might miss the airfield entirely. He didn't need to shoot them all down. He just needed to be reckless enough to make them flinch. Adair tightened his shoulder harness until it dug into his flight suit. He flipped the gun sight on. He ignored the 40 fighters waiting to pounce and pulled the nose of the heavy P-40 up, straight into the teeth of the enemy formation. The Iron Dog was going to hunt. To hunt a superior force, Adair had to abandon every survival instinct drilled into him at flight school. The standard interception manual called for a coached approach. Wait for wingmen, coordinate altitude, and peel off the enemy fighter screen before engaging the bombers. But Adair didn't have wingmen, and he didn't have time. He shoved the throttle of the P-40 Newtons to the firewall, demanding war emergency power from the Allison engine. The manifold pressure gauge surged past 50 inches of mercury. The airframe shuddered as the prop bit into the humid air, clawing for altitude. He wasn't trying to dogfight. He was positioning himself for a slash-and-dash attack that relied on a psychological gamble. Japanese bomber crews in 1943 were disciplined to a fault, flying in tight Vic formations, 3-plane wedges that interlocked their defensive machine gun fire. As long as they held formation, they were a flying fortress. But if that geometry was broken, if the pilots were startled into flinching, the defensive web would collapse. Adair's plan was heretical. He would ignore the 40 Ki-43 Oscar fighters entirely. He would fly directly through their kill zone to strike the lead bombers, betting his life that the chaos he created would protect him more than any evasive maneuver could. As Lulu Bell climbed, Adair was acutely aware that he was strapped into a glass cannon. While the P-40's fuselage was built like a tank, its heart, the Allison V-1710 engine, was terrifyingly fragile. Unlike the radial engines found on the Navy's Hellcats or the Army's P-47 Thunderbolts, which were air-cooled and could keep running with a cylinder blown off, the Allison was liquid-cooled. It relied on a complex plumbing system of pressurized glycol to keep from melting down. It was a plumbing gallery wrapped in aluminum. A single 7.7mm bullet from a Japanese tail gunner puncturing a coolant line would cause the system to depressurize, the temperature to spike, and the engine to seize within minutes. Adair was taking a radiator into a gunfight. He crested at 14,000 feet, just above the enemy formation. The sun was at his back, his only advantage. Below him, the 24 Sally bombers droned on toward Dinjan, secure in their belief that the sky belonged to them. The escorting Oscars were weaving lazily above the bomber stream, their pilots likely scanning the horizon for a squadron, not a solitary madman. Adair rolled the P-40 inverted and pulled the nose through the horizon, committing to the dive. Gravity and engine power combined to turn the heavy fighter into a kinetic missile. The airspeed indicator wound past 300, then 350, then 400 miles per hour. The controls stiffened, the Iron Dog becoming a high-speed brick. He screamed down through the layer of Oscar fighters before they even registered his presence. They were looking for a fight. Adair gave them a blur. He lined up the lead Vic of Mitsubishi bombers in his reflector sight. At 400 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns erupted in the wings. The P-40 shuddered violently as the recoil slowed the aircraft's dive. Adair didn't focus on a single kill. He walked his tracers across the lead formation like a fire hose. Incendiary rounds hammered the thin wing roots and glass cockpits of the bombers. He wasn't looking for an explosion. He was looking for fear. It worked. The lead bomber pilot, startled by the sudden eruption of tracers from above, banked hard to the left. His wingman, fearing a mid-air collision, jerked hard to the right. In seconds, the tight, disciplined geometric wedge disintegrated. The defensive interlocking fire was gone. Adair flashed through the formation with inches to spare, the turbulence of the bomber's wake buffering his wings. He didn't pull up to fight. He used his massive speed to extend below the formation, trading altitude for distance, effectively vanishing against the dark green backdrop of the jungle floor before the Japanese gunners could track him. But as he hauled back on the stick to convert his speed back into altitude for a second pass, the hornet's nest kicked over. The 40 Oscar pilots, initially stunned by the audacity of the lone attacker, now realized the insult. The sky above Adair filled with wheeling, diving fighters. They peeled off in pairs, their butterfly flaps deploying, turning tight circles to cut off his escape. Adair had disrupted the bombers, but he had also just announced his position to 4 dozen angry veterans. He was now a solitary fox in a cage of wolves, and the Allison engine was already running hot, straining against the heat of the climb and the violence of the dive. He leveled off, checking his 6 o'clock. The sky was empty for a split second, and then it wasn't. Tracers whipped past his canopy. The first pair of Oscars had anticipated his climb. Adair slammed the stick forward, forcing the P-40 into a negative G pushover, effectively acting as a one-man wolf pack. He wasn't running away, he was turning back in. He was going to do it again. But this time, the enemy was waiting, and they knew exactly where his glass jaw was. They found that glass jaw immediately. As Adair hauled the P-40 Newtons around for a second pass, 2 Oscars broke from the pack and committed to a head-on intercept. This was a suicidal game of chicken, usually reserved for the desperate, but the Japanese pilots knew their 7.7mm machine guns were outranged by Adair's 50 calibers. They didn't care. They held their line, closing at a combined speed of 600 miles per hour, willing to trade their lightweight airframes for the destruction of the American threat. Adair held the trigger down, his heavy rounds shredding the cowling of the left-hand Oscar, vaporizing the pilot instantly. But the second fighter slipped through the wall of lead. A split-second burst of 7.7mm rounds walked up the nose of Lulu Bell. They didn't hit the pilot, but they did something far worse. One round punched through the aluminum skin and pierced the firewall, the armored bulkhead separating the cockpit from the engine compartment. Another severed the exhaust manifold. In an instant, the cockpit transformed from a workspace into a gas chamber. The P-40's ventilation system, designed to pull fresh air in, now acted as a vacuum for the catastrophic failure occurring inches in front of Adair's feet. A thick, acrid cocktail of burning oil, vaporized hydraulic fluid, and raw exhaust fumes flooded the cabin. But the smoke was just the visible threat. Hidden within that gray cloud was the invisible assassin: carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a biological traitor. It binds to hemoglobin in the blood 200 times more effectively than oxygen. It doesn't just suffocate you, it starves the brain while tricking the body into thinking it can breathe. Adair didn't choke. He began to drown in dry air. The system of rejection had begun. The aircraft itself was now trying to kill him. Adair yanked the canopy slide back to clear the smoke, but the slipstream at 300 miles per hour created a low-pressure zone that sucked even more exhaust into the cockpit. He was trapped in a toxic loop. His vision began to play tricks on him. The bright green jungle below started to desaturate, turning a dull, monochromatic gray. This was tunnel vision, the first stage of advanced hypoxia. The periphery of his eyesight collapsed, leaving him looking at the world through a narrowing straw. Inside his body, the physiological system was breaking down. His reaction times, honed by months of combat flying, turned slushy. His hands, gripping the stick and throttle, began to shake not from fear, but from the nervous system misfiring as oxygen-starved neurons died by the thousands. He should have been terrified. He should have been looking for a spot to bail out. But the most insidious symptom of CO poisoning is a strange narcotic euphoria. As the Oscars swarmed around him, diving and slashing at his crippled bird, Adair felt a detached, dreamlike calm. He was dying, and his brain didn't care. Yet, a primal part of his subconscious, the pilot's lizard brain, refused to quit. Through the narrowing tunnel of his vision, he saw the bomber formation trying to reform. They were 19 miles from the airfield. If they regrouped now, they could still drop their payloads. Adair, half blind and drunk on poison, shoved the throttle forward again. The Allison engine screamed in protest. The coolant temperature gauge had long since passed the red line of 210 degrees. the needle buried at the max, likely melting against the stop. The engine block was expanding from the heat, the pistons threatening to weld themselves to the cylinder walls. Every second of flight was a mechanical miracle. He dove on the bombers a third time. He couldn't aim precisely, his hands were trembling too violently, so he simply sprayed the sky. The psychological effect held. The Japanese bomber crews, seeing the smoking, burning Banshee return from the dead, broke formation again. They jettisoned their bombs into the jungle, choosing survival over the mission. The raid was broken. Adair turned Lulu Bell toward home, the adrenaline fading, leaving him alone with the poison. He had been fighting in this toxic environment for 11 minutes. Medically, he should have been unconscious. He was flying on muscle memory and willpower alone. He checked his altimeter, 7,000 feet. He needed to get down. He tried to ease the stick back to trade his remaining speed for a gentle glide path. He pulled on the control column. It moved freely in his hand. There was no resistance, no bite of the air against the elevator surfaces. The control stick, usually a heavy, responsive link to the tail section, was flopping uselessly against his thigh. He looked back. The tail section was still there, but the control cables frayed by the earlier head-on pass or snapped by the violent G-loads of the fight had finally severed. The P-40 is a nose-heavy beast. Without the tension of the elevator cables to hold the tail down, the massive weight of the engine pulled the nose over. The horizon shot upward. The jungle rushed to fill his windscreen. Adair pulled the stick all the way into his gut. Nothing. The plane entered a terminal dive, gravity taking hold of the 9,000-pound coffin. He was poisoned, on fire, and now he was falling. Gravity, usually a pilot's constant reference, had become his executioner. As the P-40 Newtons tipped past 40 degrees nose down, Adair wasn't just fighting a broken airplane. He was fighting the fundamental physics of flight design. To understand why Lulu Bell was trying to kill him, you have to look at the architecture of the Warhawk itself. The P-40 was designed around the massive Allison V1710 engine, a liquid-cooled beast that weighed nearly 1,400 pounds dry. This enormous mass sat in the nose, placing the aircraft's center of gravity CG well forward of the wing's center of lift. In normal flight, the aircraft is essentially a teeter-totter. The heavy nose wants to drop, and the tail section, specifically the horizontal stabilizer and elevator, pushes down against the air to keep the nose up. It is a delicate equilibrium of aerodynamic forces. The pilot maintains this balance through tension on the elevator cables. But when those cables snapped, the counterweight at the back of the teeter-totter vanished. The tail lost its authority, and the massive iron block of the engine instantly dragged the nose toward the earth. Adair hauled back on the stick with both hands, his boots bracing against the rudder pedals until his knees locked. The control column hit the rear stop, slamming into his stomach. It made no difference. The control surfaces were flapping uselessly in the slipstream. The connection between his hand and the aircraft's trajectory was severed. The dive steepened. 50 degrees, 60. The airspeed indicator unwound past 400 miles per hour, approaching the airframe's structural redline, VNE, or velocity never exceed. The vibration was catastrophic. The P-40, already riddled with bullet holes and missing chunks of its wing root, began to groan a high-pitched, metallic keen that pilots call oil canning, as the aluminum skin buckled and popped under the aerodynamic load. Above him, the swarm of Oscar fighters ceased their attack. They pulled up and circled like vultures. There was no point in wasting expensive 7.7 millimeters ammunition on a dead man. They knew the physics as well as Adair did. A P-40 inches, a terminal dive at this altitude, with no elevator control, had a life expectancy of roughly 15 seconds. They watched, waiting for the inevitable fireball in the jungle canopy. Inside the cockpit, the world was a blur of gray tunnel vision and screaming wind. The carbon monoxide poisoning had left Adair's limbs feeling heavy and detached, as if he were operating a puppet from a distance. His brain, starved of oxygen, struggled to process the variables. Bail out. The thought floated through the narcotic haze of his mind. Standard procedure for loss of pitch control was to jettison the canopy, roll the aircraft inverted to let gravity help you fall out, and pull the ripcord. Adair looked at the altimeter. It was unwinding like a broken clock. 3,000 feet. 2,000. 500. At 400 miles per hour, the slipstream was a solid wall. If he tried to bail out now, the wind blast would likely slam him into the tail section, breaking his back instantly. Even if he cleared the tail, He was over hostile jungle. If the fall didn't kill him, the Japanese patrols would. If they didn't find him, the tigers of the Assam Valley would. And lurking behind those logical fears was a grim, stubborn refusal. This was his aircraft. He had flown it into the teeth of 64 enemy planes. He refused to let it end as a crater in the mud. 2,000 feet. The details of the jungle were becoming sickeningly clear. He could distinguish individual trees, the texture of the canopy. The ground rush was mesmerizing. Adair was trapped in a coffin corner of aviation physics. He needed lift to pull out of the dive. Lift comes from angle of attack, pitching the wings up against the wind. To pitch the wings up, he needed the tail to push down. The tail was dead. Therefore, the nose would stay down, and he would die. It was a closed loop of logic. But in that terrifying descent, as the altimeter swept past 1,500 feet, Adair's hypoxia-addled brain latched onto a fragment of aerodynamic theory. It was something counterintuitive, something that shouldn't make sense. The problem was gravity pulling the nose down. The heavy engine was dragging him earthward because the plane was right side up. The down force was aligned with the ground. What if down was up? If the nose wanted to fall toward the canopy, toward the pilot's feet, then rolling the aircraft upside down would mean the nose would still want to fall in that direction. But relative to the horizon, falling toward the canopy when inverted means the nose moves skyward. It was a desperate, theoretical gamble. He would have to use the very weight that was killing him to save him. He would have to trick gravity into becoming his elevator. 1,200 feet. The treetops were rushing up to meet him. The Oscars were banking away, satisfied the show was over. Adair didn't think about the absurdity of the idea. He didn't calculate the drag coefficients. He simply reacted. With his last reserve of strength, he kicked the left rudder hard and slammed the ailerons over. The P-40 groaned, resisted, and then agonizingly slowly rolled onto its back. Adair was now hanging in his straps, staring straight down at the jungle that was seconds away from swallowing him whole. He waited for the nose to drop. He waited for the engine weight to do what it had been doing for the last 4,000 feet. But this time, when the nose dropped, it didn't point at the ground, it pointed at the sky. The nose dropped, but it didn't point at the ground. Because the world was upside down, the nose dropped toward the sky. Adair had successfully hacked the laws of motion. He wasn't generating lift in the traditional sense. In fact, flying a P-40 inverted with a standard airfoil is an aerodynamic nightmare that creates immense drag. But Adair didn't need efficiency, he needed pitch. By surrendering to the weight of the engine, he allowed gravity to do the job of his severed elevator cables. The 1,400-pound Allison engine pulled the nose down, relative to the cockpit, effectively holding the aircraft in a shallow climb away from the trees. But solving the physics problem created a biological one. Hanging upside down at 1,000 feet, held in place only by his shoulder harness, Adair was subjected to sustained -1 G. Blood rushed to his head, pounding behind his eyes, exacerbating the throbbing headache from the carbon monoxide. His feet were on the rudder pedals, his head was brushing the canopy glass, and the jungle floor was racing past just a few hundred feet above his head. And Lulu Bell was not built for acrobatics. The Allison V-1710 was a temperamental machine even when right side up. Inverted, the oil scavenging pumps struggled to lubricate the bearings, and the fuel pickup lines began to starve. The engine sputtered. The roar of the exhaust turned into a coughing, hacking gasp as the carburetor floats hit their stops. If the engine died, the hydraulic pump died. If the pump died, the controls would freeze entirely. Adair had to make a choice: stay inverted and starve the engine, or roll upright and enter a lethal dive. He chose both. He slammed the stick to the right. The P-40 rolled upright. Immediately, gravity reclaimed its prize. The nose dropped like a stone, and the aircraft plunged toward the trees. Adair watched the altimeter unwind 800 feet, 700, 600, but the engine roared back to life as fuel flowed freely again. He let the speed build, let the engine drink, and then, just as the treetops threatened to scrape his belly, he kicked the rudder and rolled inverted again. The nose came up. The descent stopped. The engine sputtered. Roll upright, dive, feed the engine. Roll inverted, climb, starve the engine. It was a terrifying, rhythmic dance of death. To any observer, it looked like the last throes of a doomed bird. A smoking, battered fighter plane, cartwheeling across the sky, porpoising violently between crashing and stalling. High above, the Japanese pilots of the 50th Sentai watched this display with a mix of confusion and indifference. To them, the American was already dead. No aircraft flew like that unless the pilot had lost his mind or his controls. Why waste ammunition on a plane that was clearly seconds away from impacting the jungle? Satisfied that they had claimed a kill, and with their fuel reserves running low for the return trip to Burma, the Oscar pilots banked their wings and turned east. Adair was alone again, but he wasn't dead. He had turned a fatal mechanical failure into a survival procedure that existed in no manual. He was flying a sine wave of survival, trading altitude for fuel pressure, mile by agonizing mile. Ahead, the green blur of the jungle finally gave way to the brown clearing of the Naguli airstrip, a satellite field near Dinjan. He had made it back to friendly territory. But as the runway came into view, the gravity substitution presented its final, cruel bill. He needed to land. To land, he needed his gear down. But the landing gear on a P-40 is a hydraulic system driven by the engine. He was flying inverted. If he dropped the gear now, while upside down, the heavy wheels would deploy up toward the wings, fighting gravity, likely failing to lock. If he rolled upright to deploy them, the nose would drop, and without elevator control, he would auger into the ground before the wheels ever touched the tarmac. He had to deploy the gear while upright, but he couldn't stay upright without diving. Adair needed 3 hands, one for the throttle, one for the stick to fight the roll, and one to operate the emergency hydraulic hand pump because the engine-driven pressure was failing at low RPMs. He didn't have 3 hands. He did, however, have a lap belt. In a moment of feverish ingenuity, Adair unbuckled his safety belt while flying upside down and looped the heavy canvas strap around the control stick. He cinched it tight to the seat frame, creating a crude, tension-based autopilot to hold the ailerons neutral. He rolled upright. The nose dropped. The ground rushed up. Adair ignored the horizon. He grabbed the hydraulic pump handle with his left hand and the gear lever with his right. He pumped frantically. 1 stroke, 2. The nose was passing through the horizon. 3 strokes. Thump. The red indicator light flickered to green. The gear was down. But now he was at 200 feet, diving at 160 miles per hour, with a runway threshold rushing at him that was far too short for a no-flaps, high-speed landing. And he had no way to pull the nose up to flare. He had 1 card left to play. He rolled inverted one last time. On the ground, the tower operators at Naguli grabbed their field glasses, paralyzed by the sight. A P-40 Warhawk was coming down, final approach, wheels extended, upside down. The tower operators at Naguli didn't dare breathe. Adair held the inverted attitude until the altimeter read 100 feet, the jungle canopy brushing the top of his inverted vertical stabilizer. He was committed to a maneuver that physics dictated should end in a fireball. To land, he had to roll upright. But the moment he rolled upright, the severed elevator cables would fail to hold the tail down, the heavy nose would drop, and he would drive the propeller straight into the concrete. He had to time the roll so perfectly that the nose drop coincided exactly with the wheels touching the ground. He wasn't landing, he was aiming a crash. At 50 feet, mere seconds from the threshold, Adair slammed the stick hard to the left. Lulu Bell whipped around the longitudinal axis, the horizon spinning 180 degrees in a blur of motion. The moment the wheels locked into the down position relative to the earth, gravity slammed the nose down exactly as predicted. But the runway was there to catch it. The main wheels hit the tarmac with a violence that compressed the oleo struts to their metal stops. The P-40 bounced, slewed sideways, and screamed down the runway, the tail wheel shimmying violently as it fought for purchase. Adair stood on the brakes, blowing the tires, fighting the torque of the dying engine. The aircraft ground-looped, spinning wildly in a cloud of burning rubber and concrete dust, finally coming to rest, facing the way it had come. Adair sat in the cockpit, the silence of the ground rushing in to replace the roar of the wind. His hands were vibrating so uncontrollably he couldn't unbuckle his harness. When the ground crew finally pried the canopy open, they found him gray-skinned and delirious, his blood saturated with enough carbon monoxide to kill a man twice his size. He hadn't just flown a combat mission. He had flown an 11-minute aerobatic routine while suffocating. In the debriefing rooms of the 10th Air Force, the tactical analysts were stunned. Not by the landing, though, that was a miracle, but by the intelligence reports coming in from the forward observation posts. The 24 Ki 21 Sally bombers had turned back. They had jettisoned their payloads into the empty jungle and retreated to Burma. The disruption caused by Adair's solitary suicidal plunge through their formation had shattered their nerve. Not a single bomb fell on the Dinjan or Chabua airfields. The 14 C-47 transports, loaded with the fuel that would keep China in the war, were untouched. For years, this story has been retold in hangars and forums as a legend of aerodynamic magic, with enthusiasts claiming that Adair flew inverted because the P-40 somehow glided better upside down, or that the lift vector reversal reduced drag. That is a romantic myth. The technical truth is far colder and more impressive. Adair didn't fly inverted to reduce drag. He flew inverted to weaponize gravity. He understood, through a haze of hypoxia, that a broken machine follows a new set of rules. When the cable snapped, the aircraft became a falling object. By inverting it, he turned the engine's massive weight from a liability into a makeshift control surface. He didn't defy physics. He submitted to it so completely that he found the one loophole that allowed him to survive. It wasn't the wings that saved him. It was the intellectual flexibility to realize that down is only down if you refuse to change your perspective. On the 8th of January 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell awarded Second Lieutenant Philip Adair the Silver Star. The citation was sparse, praising his gallantry in action against enemy forces, but it missed the deeper reality. Adair had defined the spirit of the Burma Banshees, the ability to take an obsolete, broken, forgotten machine and force it to do the impossible simply because the alternative was unacceptable. Philip Adair went on to fly 89 more combat missions. He became an ace, survived the war, and served his country for decades, but his legacy isn't measured in medals or kill counts. It is measured in the 14 47 seconds that took off the next morning, climbing over the hump to China, their fuel tanks full, their engines humming, safe because one man in a broken plane refused to accept that he was already dead. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of the Mustang or the Spitfire. It was always too heavy, too slow, too old. But on the 13th of December 1943, Philip Adair proved that in the hands of a master, the Iron Dog didn't need to be the best plane in the sky. It just needed to be the one that wouldn't quit. That refusal to quit reverberated far beyond the cockpit of one damaged fighter. It echoed through the entire China-Burma-India theater. The Japanese High Command had planned the destruction of the Dinjan supply hub based on a calculated certainty that a single obsolete P-40 could not disrupt a coordinated heavy bomber raid protected by 40 fighters. They had run the numbers on airspeed, turn radius, and firepower, and the math was undeniable. But they had failed to account for the one variable that cannot be measured in a wind tunnel: the American capacity for desperate mechanical improvisation. Philip Adair did not survive the morning of December 13th because of luck, and certainly not because of the aerodynamic magic often cited in simplified retellings. He survived because he possessed the technical intellect to reject the binary logic of fly or crash. When the cable snapped and the system failed, he didn't freeze. He rewrote the operating manual in real time. He treated the loss of elevator control not as a death sentence, but as a new set of physical parameters. A puzzle to be solved with the only tools left: gravity, a seatbelt, and a terrifying amount of inverted flight time. His victory ensured that the aluminum trail, the lifeline of C-47 seconds struggling over the Himalayas, remained unbroken. The fuel he saved that morning powered the fighters of the 14th Air Force that would eventually drive the enemy from the skies over China. The Burma Banshees proved that while Washington might have sent them the oldest planes in the inventory, they had sent the right men to fly them. But Philip Adair wasn't the only pilot in the Pacific Theater who looked at a standard-issue aircraft and decided that the factory specifications were merely a suggestion. While Adair was hacking gravity in a P-40, another officer, thousands of miles away in New Guinea, was walking around a B-17 Flying Fortress with a welding torch in his hand. He had decided that the heavy bomber didn't have enough guns, and that the official manuals on structural integrity were holding him back from a mission that would make Adair's odds look favorable. He was about to turn a bomber into a battleship and fly it into the darkest corner of the Japanese Empire. We will deconstruct the mechanical insanity of J. Zemer and the old 666 in our next brief. If you believe that the history of warfare is defined not by the specs on a blueprint, but by the engineers and pilots who defy them, click that subscribe button. We are building an archive of military history that respects the technical truth over the comfortable myth. Like this video to help the algorithm find more students of history, and let us know in the comments. What is the most radical field modification you've ever heard of in combat? Dismissed.